بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه تعز من تشاء وتذل من تشاء بيدك الخير رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته جزاكم الله خير for allowing us to present on this topic. So I just want to briefly introduce myself and Maulana Saleh here. I'm the Deputy Director at Khalil Center. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I don't think neither one of us could claim to be scholars of Alama Iqbal or the poetry for that. But personally, my interest has always been more related to my own personal development and also psychological development and what Alama has to offer to me as a psychologist and also to the clients that we work with. Maulana Saleh Basir here is an IFTA student at Dar al Qasim. He's a master's candidate at the University of Chicago and focuses on late Mughal period, the rise of colonialism in India, and his primary interests are Hanafi legal theory, Indian Persian poetry, and creative writing. So with that, inshallah, jazakallah khair for joining us today. I know you're also busy, but this is a topic that we've been wanting to discuss for a very long time, and I think hopefully we can do some justice to it. So we want to talk a little bit about, inshallah, the spiritual ripples of Iqbal's grief. Now, I want to do a brief introduction to Alama because there are people who don't know who Alama Iqbal is. Alama Iqbal can be described in many different words. He's a poet. He's written Urdu and Farsi poetry. He's a philosopher, a scholar, and also a politician. He was born in 1877 in what modern-day Pakistan, Sialkot. He was raised very early on by his father and the teachers that he had, really grounding him into the Deen, Islam. And I think that's a very important aspect that we need to recognize, whether it comes to us raising our children and what we're trying to do as Muslims in even here, but also recognizing that Allama has always been grounded, and his poetry, his teachings, all of that comes through that grounding. That he, there's not much objection that people who criticize him can place in him regarding his basic views and aqidah in Islam. He comes from a Kashmiri family, and he traveled the world. He was in England and Germany, and had degrees in law and philosophy as well. And one thing that I feel like his travels and his exposure to the West and to the Muslims did was allow Alama to see that the difference in this post-colonial, like early post-colonial India, and the Indian Muslims, and the non-Muslims and others who are flourishing in other parts of the world, and for him to reflect as a philosopher, like what is the root cause of that. And the grief that he mentions in his poetry, we want to kind of address that today, inshallah, is that this grief which manifests as a result of this lost status of Muslims in the world. So, Lana, if you want to start out with just kind of talking about when I say lost status and lost identity, how would you summarize that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we first have to understand where Iqbal is sort of born. So he's born in British, as Dr. Fahad said, British Indian Sialkot, and Muslims had ruled northern India for about 700 to 800 years, and that continuity of Muslim rule and the sudden shock of Muslim rule simply just stopping, like you can tell, impacted almost every single section of Muslim society, and so much so that the British were so apprehensive of what they were doing. They were essentially trying to limit Muslims' access to their own language, so they replaced, Persian with English in the 1830s to sort of stop that, relationship with the past and stuff like that. And I think that, for Iqbal, who's sort of born in this moment, as we just spoke about, the last Mughal king was sort of exiled in 1857, and Iqbal was born in 1877. So just 20 years, Iqbal is sort of an inheritor to that, right? To that trauma, to that loss. I'll go into the story of the last Mughal king a little bit later. But I think that for those of us as Muslims who have grown up in the, hearing about Iqbal, I think obviously the poem that people hear the most about is the poem Shikwa or Shakwa, depending on the word, but this poem is super interesting because the word shikwa, or complaining, sort of has this like negative connotation in the Islamic tradition, right? Like I'm sure we all heard Jummah khutbahs of don't complain, just don't think about it, just move on. Why are you complaining? But what's super interesting is that in the Quran, Allah quotes Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam, where Sayyidina Yaqub says, "Qala innama ashku bathi wa huzni ila Allah." That Sayyidina Yaqub says, literally uses the same word ashka, that I literally complain about my grief to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in many ways, we can say the first major poem, Iqbal has obviously almost, I think, 12,000 lines of poetry. So this poem, the Shikwa, it's a musaddas poem, or a six couplet sort of based poem. And it's really phenomenal because the way that Iqbal is sort of able to articulate the grief of the ummah in this poem, I think, is sort of unrivaled, unmatched, and I would say across the Muslim world, from Istanbul all the way to South Asia, And I think like there's a very specific reason why Iqbal is able to express that, and perhaps one of the major reasons why is because Muslims, after having ruled South Asia for 800 years, and then not being able to do that, but also knowing that even if the British were to leave, then Muslims would probably not rule Delhi again. Whereas in Egypt, while the British were ruling Egypt, Muslims sort of knew that once the British leave, Cairo would be theirs, or once the French leave Syria, Damascus would. Delhi, being the Baghdad or Damascus of India, was sort of forever lost, even though Muslims had built up that city for 800 years. It was never a global city until the Muslims came. And this is a huge state. So the wealthiest city in pre-modernity. So I think like considering all of that, for Iqbal writing this poem, which is the Shikwa, he's also interlacing, I'm just going to give just further background on this poem, that he's sort of further lacing the genre of the ghazal, which obviously started off in Jahiliyyah or pre-Islamic Arabia, taking inspiration from the qasaid and stuff, where a lover is sort of addressing his beloved, right? And obviously the most famous example of that is Layla Majnun, where Majnun was besought and enchanted with Layla, and Layla sort of would not return the affections. There's like that famous Arabic line of أمر على الديار ديار ليلى أقبل ذا الجدار وذا الجدار وما حب الديار شغفنا قلبي ولكن حب من يسكن الديار. That I wander around the walls of Layla and I kiss the walls of the city where Layla lives, and it's not the walls of the city that has enchanted me, but it's the one who lives inside the city that has enchanted my heart, right? So this idea of that you're wandering, you're seeking your beloved, you're trying to find her in the bazaar, she's not returning the affection, so you're writing this poetry, etc., and so forth, which is, you can say, a sort of dunyawi form of expression. And Iqbal, I think, is the first person who takes this, 800-year-old tradition of India and then takes it to the heavens, where he addresses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the beloved. Because in Urdu poetry, there's very specific genres of hamd is praise of Allah, na'at is praise of the Holy Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, and then you had everything else, which is addressing the human beings. But Iqbal sort of does this incredible creative act. He's also interlacing the Shia genre of poetry of the Marsiyas and the Nohas, which is these laments of Sayyidina Hussein radiallahu anh, and he's sort of synthesizing genres in ways that nobody has done before. And like that's what I think it makes it very, very exciting to read, especially if you're more familiar with this tradition, because you're seeing all of these sort of the Arabic tradition, the Persian tradition, the Central Asian tradition, the sort of Turkic tradition, and then he's taking the Shia tradition, the Sunni tradition, and then obviously Sanskrit themes as well. All of this is sort of happening at the same time in one poem, while also reckoning with the social reality of Muslims, of which, today there are about 52 Muslim majority nations. I think 49 are under colonialism, except for Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey. And so that means that every other country, Indonesia, Malaysia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, obviously India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Morocco, Algeria, Senegal, Mauritania, literally everything, Albania, Bosnia, you name it, Azerbaijan, Georgia, they're all under colonialism. So like you can imagine what that must have felt to live in that moment. And so for Iqbal, he's taking his complaint straight to the heavens, right? And this idea, but yeah, that's a sort of introduction.
I appreciate that. When you were speaking, I was also thinking about like losing that central sultanate that they had right, in Delhi. For Muslims, it was also traumatic because through that leader, through a khalifa, or through someone that you're looking up to, it's kind of like losing a father figure, right? Yeah, because if you have problems, you can always go back to that individual. You can always say, hey, we have a control, we have someone that we can look up as a leader. Now it's gone, it affects your identity as well.
Absolutely.
Right? So then Muslims are looking for some kind of like guidance, and they're not able to find it anywhere else. And during his life, we also see the fall of the Ottomans.
Absolutely. He's
right?
literally
Right.
an adult when that happens,
Right.
right?
Right. Okay, so and the other thing that you said was that be able to synthesize all these languages. I think Urdu plays a big role there as well, because Urdu is that language that can really, coming from all those languages, can really express in ways that each of the languages might not be able to.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that again, Urdu is a metaphor for almost all of Islam, right? And in the same way that we as Muslims in America are really thinking about how do we sort of cultivate a new future, well, amongst all of these ethnicities of Muslims, well, it's like, well, we already actually proved that to be true in Mughal India. We already sort of tested it out. But yeah,
do you want to go through?
Yeah, so we were going to go through some lines of his Shikwa, just to sort of show you a glimpse of what he's feeling. So Iqbal wrote this poem in 1908. He actually wrote this for an organization called Anjuman-e-Himayat Islami in Lahore, when the Ottomans lost all of the Balkans. So now Muslims were not ruling any European territories for the first time, I think in like 700 years or something. And there was a fundraiser and stuff, but it's in 1908. So the Ottomans are still there, but they're not ruling any European territories. So Spain, so Western Europe has obviously been lost for 500 years. Now Eastern Europe is also sort of lost too. So he is now reckoning with that is obviously tough. So he starts off where he says, "Kyun ziyare kar banu sood faramosh rahun, fikre farda na karu mahve ghame dosh rahun, naale bulbul ke sunu aur hama tangosh rahun, hum nawa mein bhi koi gul hun ke khamosh rahun." That he says that why I love your translation where you said that why am I so self-destructive that I am unable to think about my advancement of tomorrow, that I'm literally unable to focus on what tomorrow can hold because I'm stuck on the grief that's of yesterday, literally the grief of the shoulder, but the grief of yesterday. So it's that I'm stuck in the past, right? And as we were saying, that a lot sometimes we get criticized of why are Muslims stuck in the past all the time? Let them move on. But let me show you what Iqbal says. And he says that should I only just listen to the lament of the nightingale? And it obviously has a lot of implications, right? Because the nightingale's lament, depending on your interaction with it, can either be very sad or very beautiful. So he says that should I just sort of escape all of this, escape all of the social realities, and just listen to this nightingale? And then he says, my fellow singers, hamnava, my fellow singers, right?
My fellow criers.
My fellow criers. Should I be silent like a rose? So that in the same way that a rose is beautiful and contains a lot, but it can't express anything. It's just there for show, right? And I think that he's sort of destabilizing the Muslim of the moment and Muslims of the past. And it's like they're carriers of this incredible, beautiful tradition, but they are unable to really do or say anything. So he wants to express this, the idea of an expression. And then that's why he says at the end that I'm complaining to Allah, may my mouth be filled with dust, right? That am I doing something disrespectful? Am I doing something bay'adab? So but I'm still going to do it, but may my mouth be filled with dust. And perhaps it's obviously the word khak and flowers. Flowers are coming out of this idea that maybe a flower will emerge from his mouth. But yeah.
जुरत आमोज मेरी ताब सुखन है मुझको शिकवा अल्लाह से खाकम बदान है मुझको. This idea of shikwa, I think I also want to ask you about this. The reaction that even Muslims had to this idea of shikwa to Allah, right? Because it's like the idea of complaining to Allah. Even now, like you said, people say don't complain to Allah. If you have a problem, keep it to yourself. If you have a problem, like even to psychologists or therapists, don't talk about it, right?
Yeah.
So he's doing it in probably the most productive way, which is I'm going to make a complaint straight to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because my grievance in a many way is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right?
SubhanAllah, yeah.
I was going to say that this idea of presenting it, and what was the reaction like? How did people take that? Because from my understanding is that, like, especially in the religious community, there was a strong reaction, opposition towards the idea of why are you complaining to Allah? And this poem was very like, in some ways it was problematic in certain circles.
Yeah, so I have heard that, but I've actually done research into it. I haven't seen anything in particular. I've heard these stories of the ulama called him a kafir and stuff like that. I haven't really seen that to be true. I've also read most of his letters from this time, and he doesn't mention any of that. Good. So I just wonder if it's just that, like, the sort of secular Pakistani thing of like, look, see, the Maullanas don't like anything, and it sort of plays into that stereotype of like, look, they don't like Iqbal. So like I wonder if it's that sort of Islamophobia emerging that sort of has created this fiction.
Yeah, and I appreciate that he's owning this grief, and again, he's expressing it rather than not expressing it at all. What sometimes people do is trying to blame like other people. You know, he doesn't do that in this here. He doesn't say that they're like this or
It was the
they're
the Ottomans' fault or
Yes.
the Mughals'
He
fault.
doesn't go into
Yeah.
that.
Absolutely. You know, and then, you know, and this idea of expressing grief is so important because I think like this theme of like in the first 6 stanzas of like expressing and unexpressing is sort of really blazes through because he says, "Qissa dard sunate hai ki majboor hai hum," right? That we are literally forced, majboor, we literally have no choice but to narrate a story of grief. Qissa, and that's really what it is. It's a story of grief. Right? And then साज़ खामोश है फरियाद से मामूर है हम नाला आता है अगर लब पे तो माज़ूर है हम. Right? So you see this sort of really beautiful interaction of music, of flowers, of instruments, and of grief, of the mouth. Right? All of this is sort of coming together. Right? And anybody sort of aware of Urdu and Persian poetry would have immediately recognized all of these images, very strong, very felt images. So he says that our instruments are silent, but O Allah, inside these instruments are literally brimming with grief. Right? Or complaint, literally, with faryad, right? Ma'mur is almost like civilized, right? From ammara. Nala atahe, if any complaint comes on our mouth, oh Allah, then we are excused. So almost, this idea of ma'zur is very interesting because in fiqh, when you're ma'zur, whether aqlan or jisman, i.e. if you are cognitively ma'zur, if you have suffered any form of insanity, you are no longer mukallaf. Right. So if you are insane, and this is not a controversial thing, this is by all because this is the hadith of the Holy Prophet والسلام, that the penny was lifted on 3 people. One of them is someone who is insane. So almost that Iqbal is like, oh Muslims, or even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, don't judge me for anything that I say because my grief has led me to insanity and I am no longer mukallaf of ahkam. So that's why, and I just want to say, the Indian Persian poets would say, Ba khuda divana bash, ba Muhammad haushad. That say that when you write poetry about God, be ecstatic. Be absolutely ecstatic, but watch your tongue when you write about the Prophet. But that was like a sort of guiding principle that like when you write poetry about Allah, be ecstatic. He's your beloved. You know, he's aqrabu ilayhi min hablil warid, right? And so be ecstatic about God, be ecstatic about the Prophet too, but also watch. Have a lot of adab.
Yeah, in the last line of that stanza where he says that Jawab-i-Shikwa arbabi wafa bhi sun le khugare hamd se thoda sa gila bhi sun le, that oh Allah, please hear this complaint from those who have proven loyalty, right? We through our actions we have proven, and this tongue, which is the khugare hamd, is like that which has been gotten used to praising you, which is the tongue here. Listen to some grievance from this as well. Like we praise you all the time throughout the day, and now if I'm giving something back and it might appear negatively, then I have the right to do that.
Which is the Sufis would say this is also a form of praise,
Yes.
right? And that like complaining to Allah is actually also a form of tasbih and tahmid, right? And because really, and I think this is where we learn from Hazrat Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam, is that how can we say that, Sayyidina Yaqub, they spoke about his, in fact, the exact ayah says, تَفْتَأُ تَذْكُرُ Yusuf, that you are doing dhikr of Yusuf alayhi salam, but you're not supposed to do dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he was doing dhikr of his grief of Yusuf. So this idea that a prophet was doing dhikr of grief, and that's a prophetic act, that's a sunnah. And this is the exact word Allah uses. This is the Quran is the uncreated word of Allah. Allah uses the words تَفْتَأُ تَذْكُرُ Yusuf. You are doing dhikr of Yusuf, that you are almost about to kill yourself. The sons are telling Sayyidina Yaqub, a prophet of Allah. So this idea of dhikr of grief is a deeply prophetic act, I would say, and this is I feel like a very uncontroversial reading of the ayah in the Quran.
I would also add the idea of munajat with Allah, right? So like oftentimes when we have a problem, we make dua to Allah. Dua is good. Dua is a form of ibadah, but munajat is like this conversation you have with Allah. It's kind of like the same conversation you might have with a close friend, a spouse, or a therapist.
Absolutely. I was gonna say it comes from the word najwa, which means to like whisper in the ear of like your beloved. Najwa.
So I recommend this usually to even clients that it's okay if you wanted to have this conversation with Allah where you're telling Allah what's happening, right? Allah, this is what happened to me at work today. I had this anxiety. I was stressed out when this happened. That person said this to me. That conversation is not it's actually a healthy thing to do, because then you're able to express it rather than keep these small things inside, which over time can pile up and become very destructive.
Absolutely, because the question we need to ask is, why don't you say that Yaqub alayhi salam keep quiet about his grief? And I think that's what we need to so then later on in the poem he says, he sort of talks about all the accomplishments of Muslims, right? And he's sort of bleeding two genres. One is the genre again of the ghazal, of like the lover, the majnoon who's looking for Layla, but his affectations are not reciprocated, etc. But he's also bringing that munajat tradition of, oh Allah, didn't we do all of this for you, right? So he says, he brings in this really, really beautiful line where he says, बस रहे थे यही सल्जूक भी तुरानी भी अहले चीन चीन में ईरान में सासानी भी इसी मामूर में आबाद थे यूनानी भी इसी दुनिया में यहूदी भी थे नसरानी भी पर तेरे नाम पर तलवार उठाई किसने बात जो बिगड़ी हुई थी वो बनाई किसने. And then later on he says,
let me translate that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in this world were dwelling the Seljuks and the Turkistanis, like Turani, the Chinese in China and the Sassanids in Iran. In this realm the Greeks also lived. So did the Jews and the Christians. But who dared to pick up the sword in your name and clean up the mess created by other dynasties? Like it was us Muslims who did that.
Yeah, and then I'm going to read the Urdu and then you translate the English again.
Sure.
थी हमें एक तेरे मारिका आराओं में, खुशकियों में कभी लड़ते कभी दरियाओं में, दी अजाने कभी यूरोप के कलीसाओं में और कभी अफ्रीका के तपते हुए सहराओं में, शान आंखों में न जचती थी जहांदारों की, कलीमा पढ़ते थे हम छाओं में तलवारों की.
We were alone. We were alone who fought in your battlefields. We fought sometimes in dry lands and sometimes in rivers. We sometimes gave your call in the churches of Europe and other times in the burning deserts of Africa. The splendor of kings did not amaze our eyes, while we affirmed your oneness under the shade of swords.
And then अगर ऐन लड़ाई में अगर वक्त नमाज तो क़िबला रूह हो कि ज़मीन बोस हुए कौम हिजाज, एक ही सफ में खड़े हो गए महमूद आयाज, न कोई बंदा रहा और न कोई बंदा नवाज.
You want to finish that?
बंदा साहिब व मुहताज व गनी एक हुए, तेरी सरकार में पहुंचे तो सब भी एक हुए.
If the time of prayer came during the battle, the nation of Hijaz faced the Qibla and kissed the ground. Both Mahmud and Ayaz, we could talk a little bit about that too, stood in one row. No difference remained in the master or the slave. The slave, the master, the needy, and the rich all became one. In your presence, they were all brothers and became one.
So Iqbal is painting this image, right, of Muslims who have accomplished so much. They spread Islam from West Africa to Spain to India to Central Asia to Europe. The azan, we gave azan in the churches of Europe, right? Literally, the Muslims in Andalus gave azan in the churches of Europe. The Ottomans gave azan in the churches of Serbia and Austria, right? And so it's Allah. We did, like, who did we do this for? Did we do this for ourselves, or did we do this for you, right? So Allah, if we did this for you, then why are we being treated like this? Are we not your most loyal servants, right? And then I think this is perhaps like the most controversial line, where he says, "Safai dahr se batil ko mitaya humne, naw insan ko gulami se churaya humne, tere Kaabe ko jabinon se basaya humne, tere Quran ko seenon se lagaya humne, फिर भी हमसे ये गिला है कि वफादार नहीं, हम वफादार नहीं, तू भी तो दिलदार नहीं."
He's talking to Allah here, right? So he said, we raised the falsehood from this world of yours. We freed the son of Adam from enslavement. We populated your Kaaba with prostrations. We brought your Quran closer to our hearts. Still, the complaint is that we are not loyal. If we're not loyal, then you are also not living in our hearts. Like, you're also not the one who's carrying, who's like the idea of like Allah lives in our hearts, right? That He speaks from there. That you're also not there. So it's not a one-way thing that we're not loyal, but you're not also, mirroring that loyalty.
Absolutely, and it's this thing that if our loyalty is not sort of validated by you, O Allah, then what's the point of all of this? Was this all worth it, right? And I'm sure a lot of us have thoughts like that sometimes. It's like, oh Allah, I've prayed namaz, I'm praying namaz, I'm fasting. Why is Allah treating me like this? Could you expand on that? I'm sure you've dealt with patients who have said that.
Right, and I'm doing whatever I can, and I'm suffering. Like I'm doing what I'm supposed to do as a Muslim, and then I'm suffering, and I'm getting all the difficulties and hardships and relationships and finance and all those problems. So what is it that I'm doing wrong?
Yeah.
Right? You ask this like a one-way kind of thing. Like, why is it that I'm not getting what I'm supposed to get? What I see all these other people out there happy.
Yeah. And then I think even like the next line, really, exactly. And then he says, "Ummate aur bhi hai, unme gunahgar bhi hai, ijz wale bhi hai, mast mein pindar bhi hai, unme kahil bhi hai, ghafil bhi hai, hoshar bhi hai, सैकड़ों हैं कि तेरे नाम से बेजार भी है, रहमतें हैं तेरे अग़यार के काशानों पर, बर्फ गिरती है तो बेचारे मुसलमानों पर.
Yeah. There are other nations that contain many sinners. There are weak ones, those who are drowned in arrogance, some who are lazy, some heedless, and some aware. Many are those who are aversive to your name. Yet the rain of your mercy is showered upon the others, and the lightning always strikes the poor Muslims.
Right? And I think like that same thought, it's like, Allah, we're praying namaz, we're fasting. Why are we suffering? Why are we being tested? And Iqbal is saying this too, that, you know, the Malana on the member who's screaming at us for saying that, you know, pray your namaz, Allah will change your condition. But it's like Iqbal is sort of saying, well, the non-Muslims are not praying namaz, so why is Allah treating them better?
Mhm.
And that's really the question here.
And even I think right now in this day and age, this is more than 100 years after this poem was written, this thought is still there with Muslims. They see like, how come Muslim countries are always behind? How
Yeah,
come Muslims are always behind? All
absolutely.
these other people are doing so well in this, and that sometimes, especially there's a lot of anger and frustration and emotions that leads people against Islam. There's a lot of youngsters who
Absolutely.
start making a comparison. They're like, wait a second, you see non-Muslim countries this way, Muslim countries this way, so Muslims are doing something wrong, must be Islam.
Yeah.
And they kind of shift away from that.
And in fact, a lot of the Orientalists, when they colonized India and Algeria and Syria, they said the main reason why you guys are not us is because of Islam, right? That Islam is holding you backwards,
Yes.
Holding you back, right? And so it's that Iqbal is sort of expressing that oh Allah, that if it's because we're not presenting a'mal to you, we're not doing good deeds, we're not, we're not staying away from sins. These people aren't staying away from sins either. So why are they entitled to your mercy and we are not?
Yeah.
But if we can just, this one line is so beautiful. But Saram Khano mein kehte hai ki Musalman gaye, hai khushi unko ki Kaaba ke nigahban gaye, manzil dahr se unton ke hudi khan gaye, aur apni baghlon mein dabaye hue Quran gaye. Khandazan kufre ihsas tujhe hai ki nahi, apni tawheed ke kuch paas tujhe hai ki nahi.
So he's saying the idols are saying in their temples that Muslims have left. They are rejoicing that the defenders of Kaaba have gone. Those who used to control the camels through their songs have left the land. They left the Quran held tightly under their arms, like the Quran teachings. The disbelievers are mocking you. Do you not care? Your faith in oneness is at risk. Have you not do you not have any concerns?
Right, this idea that Allah, that we want to succeed for your tawheed. So why aren't we succeeding? Right? And then he sort of really asked very forcefully that Q Musalmano mein hai daulat dunya nayab, that Allah, why are Muslims so deprived of just basic material needs in this world? That why are Muslims suffering in poverty? You know, he has this line in Farsi where he says, Shabi pish khuda begaristim zar Musalmana chura azaran do kharan nida ahmad ke namidani in qawm dili daran do mahbubi nadaran. This is that one night I was weeping in Lahore in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says that, oh Allah, why are only Muslims reviled in this? Why, oh Allah, it seems that you only revile Muslims. Every other qawm seems to be doing okay, but only Muslims are reviled in this world, right? You can think about the Islamophobia of China, the Islamophobia of India, the sort of invasion of Muslim lands, all of this, France, everybody just seems to hate Muslims. I mean, even today, 100 years ago, it's always just Muslims, Indian news, it's always like Muslims are the cause of this, Muslims are the cause of that, etc., etc. And then Iqbal says, Nida ahmad kanamidani in qawm. That a voice came from the unseen that, oh, Iqbal, you don't know today's Muslims, that they have a heart, but they've forgotten how to love the Prophet. So this idea of that active love, I just wanted to do one more line of Shikwa, and then I think we can sort of shift.
Yes.
I do just, he says, Dard Layla bi wahi, Qais ka pahlu bi wahi, Ummat Ahmad Mursal bi wahi, tu bi wahi. That, oh Allah, the grief of Layla is still here, right? Majnoon's passion is still here. Oh Allah, the prophets, we are still the ummah of the Prophet. You are still the same and we are still the same. So why do you look at us with such anger? That, oh Allah, why do you look at us with such anger? Your own lovers, right? With an eye of wrath. Tujhko chora ke Rasool Arabi ko chora. Oh Allah, did we abandon you? Did we abandon the Arab prophet to deserve all of this? And I feel like some of these lines, you can really feel how Iqbal, who is living in British India, who then travels to London, travels to Germany, both colonial metropoles, and is thinking that, oh Allah, if the Quran is the final revelation, if the Holy Prophet is your most beloved of God, then we as people who affirm the finality of the Prophet, of the revelatory nature of the Quran, then why are we being treated like this, right? And then finally, I will say that, and then I wanted you to expand on this when he says, लुत्फ मरने में है बाकी ना मजा जीने में कुछ मजा है तो यही खून जिगर पीने में कितने बेताब है जौहर मेरे आईने में किस कदर जलवे तरपते हैं मेरे सीने में. So he says that Iqbal is talking literally about himself, that I have no more joy in life, and the only joy is in dying. Only death can bring me joy, right? So what does that mean? That it seems that Iqbal, in sort of relating to the grief of the Muslims, that he literally felt like there was no purpose for me to live anymore, right? Like it's almost, I don't want to say it's like suicide ideation, but it's, and I wouldn't go that far, but the language sort of suggests that, right? That like there's.
I translate a little bit differently, right?
Go ahead.
Differently.
Go ahead.
I see it as when he says "Lutf marne mein hai baki na maza jeene mein." I think there's a connection that he's making there too, which is that there is no pleasure left in dying or even in life, right?
So, or not even death can bring a relief. Sorry,
that's how I see
you're right.
it,
because there's that double noon.
Yes,
you're
possible,
right. Yeah.
Possible, yeah. But the only thing left that gives us any pleasure is to be in this state of grief, right? To drink the liver blood, right? The idea that this is grief inside of us and we have to own it.
And then also liver in the classical Muslim sense of being the seat of emotions, right? And so like, how do you, like when you read these two stanzas, right? That the only joy I feel, or the only enjoyment that I feel, is drinking the blood of my own liver, which is the seat of emotions. In some sense, could you articulate what perhaps Iqbal was sort of undergoing or sensing it, like in this moment of writing this, or even living in this sort of really troubling era for Muslims?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that is even present now, right? The idea that like there's so much struggle as a Muslim, as a believer, there's so many struggles that we're going through, and these struggles are not just individual, but also like familial struggles, you know, at community level. There's not, like there's and like struggles about your faith, struggles, and all that is causing emotional problems. And oftentimes, I mean, as a psychologist, I see this, like the stress that we carry from other places, we will unfortunately misdirect it towards something else, right? So like we're having struggles at work, we come home and we end up, you know, being angry with our family, right? The anger wasn't really for the family. It's this anger that has been misdirected towards something else. And so I think he's trying to own that, and he's trying to recognize that this is why I'm feeling this struggle and this pain and this suffering that I'm going through. You know, he's trying to express it and say that this is like there's so many thoughts. After that, he says, right, there's so many thoughts that are ready to become apparent from my mirror, so many visions that are just yearning to get out of my chest. There's so much inside of me that I want to express, but I'm not sure how to express that other than, you know, to this grief. And then the last two lines, right?
Go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
कितने बेताब हैं जौहर मेरे आईने में, किस कदर जलवे तड़पते हैं मेरे सीने, इस गुलिस्तान में मगर देखने वाले ही नहीं. Right? Part of the reason I'm not doing it is because there's no one here who can understand, who can see this grief. There's no one here who can
share my pain,
right? Who can relate to what I'm going through. Right? दाग जो सीने में रखते हैं वो लाले ही नहीं. No one with desires is there with the pain in their heart. They don't have the same dagh in their heart, in their chest, the same mark. So they can understand that, you know, what I'm going through right now.
Absolutely, right. And I really love that line, because this idea that Iqbal felt like nobody really understood what he was going through in terms of seeing the Muslim political condition, and I think a lot of people forget that Iqbal was also a historian. I mean, the way that he understood Ottoman and Mughal history, by virtue of having access to archives at Cambridge and in Heidelberg, he knew sort of what Muslims were before modernity, before colonialism, perhaps more intimately than any alim, I think, alive, because of his access to, and also his access to his very high fluency in Persian. And I think that if you read all of that, it can really affect you. Just an own personal example, I study Mughal history, and when I read the letters of Aurangzeb, it actually kind of breaks me, in a sense of like, of a Muslim living in confidence, a Muslim living in sort of intellectual and political confidence, that they're not worried about what IMF conditions or economic sanctions or what that's going to happen. This is going to happen. I mean, Aurangzeb talking about how he's reading Ihya Ulum ad-Din in Hyderabad and in Delhi, and, you know, Islam being sort of the holistic way of living in that world and not worrying about what about this, what about that, you know, and Islam being sort of the highest form of living in the world, right? And when I read that, you can get very sad, and, you know, you can really get lost in that, you know, or even when I read sort of political chronicles of various Nawabs, like the Nizam of Hyderabad, and, stuff like that, and you see how they were able to sort of rule a kingdom or a territory and have hospitals, have incredible educational centers, have libraries of tens of thousands of books, not be afraid or insecure about their own tradition. Right? Obviously, mental health was incredibly high at that time, as we can very much see. And when you see all of that, then obviously you see today, and you're like, man, this is horrible, and like it affects you. And sometimes, no matter how much I'm enjoying reading Aurangzeb's, and we've about a couple hundred of them, and you can sort of see his consciousness manifest in his letters. I can even, there's some days I can read it, and for 2-3 months I can't read it because like really affects me. Because I'm like, how can I? Because to be implanted in that world where Allah had given Muslims literally everything, and they did a lot with it. They truly did a lot with it. And to see Islamic law, Islamic architecture, Islamic art, Islamic hospitals, Islamic medicine, Islamic political theory, all of that come together, not as just theory, but as living practice, as Muslims just living their lives, and everybody sort of wanting to be Islam. I mean, it's something that's obviously you and I have never seen that before.
Yeah. I think we tend to polarize into like, this is also probably more postmodern thought.
Yeah.
Like that, if you're a victim, if something bad is happening to you, then you're suffering.
Yeah.
And then there's no idea of growth.
Yeah.
There's no chance of growth. But if you're flourishing, then you're not going to be lavishing, right? Like this is polar opposite. But at that time, I think people were still kind of doing all of it. They were struggling, but they were still continuing to.
And I think, I think it's like, and I'm sort of going to address this, is that a lot of people talk about how like the Mughals are ayyash, or they're sort of very decadent, but it's like, yeah, they were wealthy. Sorry, is that a bad thing to be wealthy? Like Sayyidina Abdul Rahman was incredibly wealthy. So it's like either oh, Muslims are so poor, they're so faqir and gharib, that's a problem. But when they're wealthy, that's also a problem. So yeah. I wanted to read some of the Persian, if that's okay. But
sure, please.
Yeah, so he says بشاخ زندگی ما ز تشنه لبی است، تلاش چشمه حیوان دلیل کم طلبی است. حدیث دل بک بگویم چه راه برگیرم، که آه بی اثر است و نگاه بی ادبی است. غزل به زمزم خوان پرده پست و پستر گردان، هنوز ناله مرغان نوای زیر لهبی است. متاع قافله ما حجازیان برند، ولی زبان نکشای که یار ما عربی است. He says that so he brings this example of that in the old days there was an Iranian caravan who was traveling for Hajj, and they were pillaged by Arab bandits towards Medina. When we go for Hajj, there was like a 30% chance you would lose your life. So this idea that Hajj is no longer safe, well, technically it's never really been safe. So this Persian caravan was going towards Medina, and they were pillaged by an Arab band of bandits. And one of the persons says, man, la'anat on these Arabs, right? Like, how could they do this? So this became a darb al-mathal, or a proverb, that don't curse them, for our friend is Arab. So he says, he says that the Arabs have pillaged all of our belongings, but don't open your mouth because our friend is Arab. Nihali Turk ze barq farang bar avad zuhur Mustafa ra bahan bu lahabist. He says that the sapling of the Turks has gained new life because of the lightning of Europe. That like because of this interaction of Europe, Muslims can become something more. And then he gives an example. He says the emergence of the Holy Prophet could only be presaged by Abu Lahab. So that the sort of evil and the violence of Abu Lahab gives rise to Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he ends with saying, "Biya ke man zakhme pir Rum avardam. Me sukhan ke javantar zabada anabist. Come and bring the wine of Maulana Rumi, rahimahullah, for my speech may be more fresh by the music of his thought."
Yeah. So we're shifting into this idea of hope now, right?
Yeah.
If that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he has a beautiful dua that he makes in there, and the idea of, again, like, what is it that Muslims need to be able to kind of gain that status back into this world? So he says, Ya Rab dil Muslim ko wo zinda tamanna de, jo qalb ko garma de, wo jo ruh ko tadpa de. that, oh Allah, grant the hearts of Muslims a desire so alive and passionate that it sets the heart on fire and stirs his soul. Right? This, I think, Ishq and like Garmi, and this is like his whole poetry is about this, like this passionate love that fuels action. So he's a big fan of, like, there's a time to sit and think and do some thinking and intellectual debates, but there's a lot of it has to be things that we act upon. फिर वादी फारां के हर जर्रे को चमका दे, फिर शौक तमाशा दे, फिर ज़ौक़ तकाज़ा दे. Let every speck of the dust in the valley of Faran be lit through your light. Grant the longing to spectate you and make their desires pressing. This is another thing, right? Like this idea of spectating and seeing Allah in this world and in the hereafter is something that's very central to Alama Iqbal's poetry. And then, okay, let me move a little bit forward here. इस दौर की ज़ुल्मत में हर क़ल्ब परेशान को वो दाग़ मोहब्बत दे जो चाँद को शर्मा दे. That in the darkness of these times, give the troubled hearts that scar of love which puts the moon to shame. Rifat mein maqasid ko hum dosh saraya de. Raise the status of their goals. Like Muslims sometimes have a very small, like, I want to achieve this, I want to do that. No, raise their status of their goal so it matches the status of the 7 stars. Like there's no end to it. Khuddari sahil de, azadi dariya de. Grant them the calmness of the shore along with the freedom of the sea. And then the last time, which I really love, he says, "Main bulbul nala hu ek ujre gulistan ka." He calls himself bulbul, like throughout the poetry, right? I am but a nightingale in the ravaged garden. Like my garden has been ravaged. There's people have come through, like colonials have come through, and they've basically destroyed it. Tasid ka sahil hu muhtaj ko data de. I'm requesting effectiveness in my message. Grant this needy a generous Lord. And then I'll save the Jawab-i-Shikwa part.
Yeah, let me do. I'm just going to do one more Persian ghazal,
please,
just so that you can sort of hear the music of that. So he says, "Natu andar haram gunji nadar budkhana meyai." He says that the modern Muslim, you left the Kaaba so they could welcome you in the idol house, but they didn't let you in either, so you missed out on both. Walakin suyi mushtaqan che mushtaqana meyai. He says, but towards the mushtaq, towards the lovers and those who you came in with so much passion. قدم بیباک تر نه در حریم جان مشتاقان. He says that come and bring your foot fearlessly into the sanctuary of the soul of lovers. Tu sahib khana chura duzdana meyan. He says you own the house. Why do you walk in like a thief? That you own this house, don't walk in like a thief, right? This idea of insecurity, that where am I in this world, identity issues. He's like, you own the house, right? You are a Khalifa of Allah. And Allah says the Khalifa of the entire earth. Right, so don't walk in like you don't own the house. بغارت می بری سرمایه تسبیح خانان را و شبخون دل زناریان ترکان میایی گهی صد لشکر انگیزی که خون دوستان ریزی. He says sometimes though Muslims you come in with 100 soldiers and you spill the blood of other Muslims. He's talking about the sort of backstabbing that happened with Mir Ja'far when one Mughal Nawab broke the pact with the Mughal king and backstabbed the Mughal king with the East India Trading Company. But then sometimes you come into our gathering with a wine bottle in hand to come and drink with us. Tu bar nakhli kalimi bay mahaba shu'ala mayrazi tu bar sham'i yatimi surate parvana mayai. He says you were on the date palm tree of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. Without care you set it on fire. Right? You were literally on the date palm tree of Sayyidina Musa. And you set it on fire. Then, like a moth, you went traveling to a candle that was an orphan. Biya Iqbal, Jami as khomistani khudi dar kash. Come Iqbal, come and drink from your own self. Biya Iqbal, za khomistani khudi dar kash. Ketu az mekhana ay maghrib za khud begana meyai. That you have left the Western White House as a stranger unto your own self. And then he says, that with one glance of the Holy Prophet, he took the whole Hijaz in my heart. Because earlier he says, in the tremor and in the flame of the wine house of the Ajam, I could never feel that burning and that melting. So I need the glance of the Holy Prophet to unleash the Hijaz in me.
So going over to Jawab-i-Shikwa now, right? So Jawab-i-Shikwa was poem that he wrote as a response to the shikwa. So the first was a complaint, and then he writes the answer to the complaint, and in order to address things that were presented in the complaint. So Jawab-i-Shikwa is mostly addressing the Muslim, like how would you put it, like
it's I mean, it's basically a response to the complaint, right? So it's addressing like the 19th 20th century Muslims who are sort of living in some sort of stupor, and like Allah is also explaining why is he doing this idea of hikmah, of wisdom, that Allah is Hakim, Allah is all wise, and that Allah would not be putting us in this condition if he not were Hakim, and there were not some deeper underlying hikmah sort of explaining why Muslims are colonized and beleaguered and besieged and living in sort of incredibly abject conditions.
And it's owning also the factors that Muslims contributed to this downfall as well.
Absolutely.
Right. So like, oftentimes like when I work with like teenagers, they have complaints against their parents, right?
Yeah.
Parents do this, and then it's like, well, okay, they do that, but what have you done, right? Let's also look at that. That's kind of like, I'm sure there's things that they have done wrong, but you also could have done something better.
Absolutely.
So it's not to just keep blaming and just become the victim, rather, let's also look at that. So here he says, "Ahde no barq hai, aatish zade har khirman hai, eman isse koi sahara na koi gulshan hai. इस नई आग का अक़वाम कोहन ईंधन है, मिल्लत ख़त्म रसूल शोलाए बपहरहन है, आज भी हो जो इब्राहिम का ईमान पैदा, आग कर सकती है अंदाज़ से गुलिस्ता पैदा." It says this new age is like a lightning. It's ready to set fire to every house. It's amazing. He's bringing that in, the idea of fire. Like imagine just lightning striking and everything is just catching on fire, and no place in the world will be protected from it. This new fire burns with the fuel from the traditions of the old nations. Even the nation of the last prophet wearing its garment is ablaze from it. Even Muslims have caught with this fire as well. But then what does he say? Even if today people, now we know the story of fire cooling down, which is Ibrahim alayhi salam. So he says, even if today the faith of Ibrahim is brought forth, fire can turn itself into a cool garden. Like, so it's even though everything is on fire, there's still hope, because what you have to do is bring that iman of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Let me skip over a little bit forward. So and then he talks about like how the different nations have faded. He said, "Tuna mit jayega Iran ke mit jane se, nasha-e mai ko talluq nahi paymane se." That you're not going to finish or go away just because Iran had come to an end. He says the potency of drink is not related to the vessel. Right? For us, the potency of drink comes from the teachings of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It's not related to the idea that it's us or the country, like which country or which Muslims are doing it. It's the teaching itself that's important. And then he ends that with Kashti Haq ke zamane ka sahara tu hai, asre no raat hai, dhundla sa sitara tu hai. That you are the support that keeps the ship of this truth afloat in this time. Like you Muslims. And the modern time is in darkness. You are the star. He calls it a dim star. Right? Like, you're dim right now and you're struggling, but still that means that there is hope in that stars. And so then ending the Jawab-i-Shikwa, he basically nails it down to like what needs to happen for Muslims to kind of regain their status. So in one of the last stanzas, he ends it. He says, "Quwwat ishq se har past ko bala kar de, dehr mein isme Muhammad se jala kar." He said, if you really want to raise the status, like all of those who have gone down, bring them back up, then you have to bring in this love, the force of love, the force of passion. And he said, take the name of Muhammad and bring light in this world. And then he spends the next two stanzas on just the name of Rasulullah, right? Hona ye phul to bulbul ka tarannum bhi na ho. That if this flower, the name of the Prophet wasn't there, and he's just talking about the name, then the nightingale wouldn't even be able to sing. There would be no like smell, no presence of rosebuds in this garden. ये नसाकी हो तो फिर मैं भी ना हो, खुम भी ना हो, बस में तौहीद दुनिया में ना हो, तुम भी ना हो. That if Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam wasn't there, then there would be nothing for us to get, like no drink, there would be nothing that we can take, there's no container, there would be no tawheed in this dunya, and there would be no you, like your presence, all the thing that you talked about, how we took over tawheed, this is because of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Khayma iflaq ka istada isi naam se hai, nabazit hasti tabash amada isi naam se. He said this is the name that carries the tent or the covering of skies. This is the name that brings heat to our existence. And then the last line of the next stanza, he says that this name is mentioned throughout, right? If you look at the name of Rasulullah is mentioned throughout the Muslim world, in all over the world, not just through the adhan, but also in our prayers and whatnot. And he says, "Chashme aqwama ye nazara abad tak dekhe, rifat shan rafa'na laka zikrak dekhe." This is beautiful because he's saying that even if you don't say anything about the name, even if you don't mention the name of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the people will see its manifestations and its greatness until the end of time. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised that when he said, وَرَفَعْنَا لَكَ ذِكْرَكَ, that we have raised your name, your dhikr, right? So he said the people will see that the manifestation of that. And then the last stanza of Jawab-i-Shikwa, he says to the person, the believer, he says, "Aql hai teri sipar, ishq hai shamshir teri." He said, look, your intellect is your shield and passion is your sword, right? So you attack with passion and you defend yourself with intellect. And that in Islam, is something that you can do that with. Mere darvesh khilafat hai jahangir teri. He says, my darvesh, like this whole world is under your command. Another line
of being Khalifa, right?
Yeah, exactly. You're Khalifa in this world.
Don't walk in like a thief into your own house.
Exactly, right? Like the other line, it says, "Ye jahan tujh se hai, tu jahan se nahi." Right? Like this world is there because of you. Yeah. You're not there because of this world.
Yeah.
Right? If we look at the idea of social, because social Darwinism was also another thing happening at the time of Alama, right? So when he's coming at time, like we're seeing this happen. So he's saying that, look, you didn't come from this world. This world was created for you. And then he says, "Ma siwa Allah ke aag hai takbir teri, tu musalman ho to takdeer hai tadbir teri." That besides Allah, your call sets everything ablaze. That fire comes from your call, and if you stay true to Islam, your planning becomes your fate. Right? This is, I think, we don't need to go into that, but Alama's idea of what is taqdeer, right? And what is the role of a Muslim in a believer or individual's action. And then the last line, which is very popular in Urdu. Ki Muhammad se wafa tune to hum tere hain, ye jahan cheez hai kya ho kalam tere hain. He says that if you want me, you want my love, my affection, like speaking from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what you need to do is you need to be loyal to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You be loyal to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I'm yours. And he says, when I'm yours, and if you have loyalty to Muhammad, this world is nothing in comparison, because the pen and tablet are yours. Like you can write, you can all of that is yours. But what's required is that you are loyal to Muhammad.
Yeah, no, and I love that, because this idea in Islam that, remember, time, just like we are creation, time is also a creation. It's a makhluk of Allah. Yes. So the fact that Muslims were able to sort of achieve so much in the face of Greek and Hellenistic thought and Mongolian sort of devastation, where they massacred tens of thousands of Muslim men and women in Samarkand, Bukhara, and Herat. It's that this moment and that moment 1,000 years is really not that different, because they're both just moments created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I really like this Farsi ghazal that he has, because it's that as Muslims, the Quran is an explanation of the cosmos, right? Of how the cosmos works, both in this world and the next world, right? So if all of this is the same, then what do we need to do to make sure that we are sort of beneficiaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, the idea of taqdeer, of being masters of our own taqdeer. So he says, "Biya ke bulbul shuridat naghma pardaz ast, urus lala sarabha ke sham o naz ast. نواز پرده غیب است ای مقام شناس نواز گلوه غزل خان نه از رگ ساز است کسی که زخم رساند به تار ساز حیات زمان بگیر که آن بنده محرم راز است." So he says, "Come, for the love mad nightingale is busy singing songs." So the nightingale is still singing music, right? So just like back then, that nightingale is still singing songs. This is sort of also, the poets would use it as a metaphor for the ayah in the Quran, وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ, that you can understand the tasbih of various creation, right? That if you could hear how the rocks and the birds praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They say Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani, that he said at some moments he could sort of start to understand the language of the birds and that praise, and he made dua for Allah to stop it because he couldn't handle it. But then, and then later on he says, "Oh connoisseur of music, right? Coming forth from strings invisible, from the ghaib," right? This idea that Muslims have understand in some form through the Quran of how the ghaib operates, right? Not from this, come forth for these strings of this instrument, of the sitar. It's invisible. It's not from the singer's throat, nor is it from the frets or the lute of the heart. Whoever strikes these strings of life's lute, take it from me, a man who knows the mysteries, right? Of how this all operates together, because the Quran is a book of explaining all of existence, right? So I have been given knowledge
مراز پرده گیسان جهان خبر دادن ولی زبان نکشایم که چرخ کج باز است. He says, I've been given knowledge of what is behind the veils, but I dare not open my mouth because the heavens are curvy. I don't know what'll happen. I don't. Kaj baz is it's twisted. So I know. And the other line, right, in Farsi where he says, "Surud rafta baz ayat kana ayat." Will the old song of Islam ever come back again? The old melody of Islam, right? Nasimi az Hijaz ayat kana ayat. Will the cold breeze of Medina from the Holy Prophet ever return back to India? Sar Ahmad Rozgari in Faqiri. The time for this Sufi has come to go. Iqbal is talking about himself. Will another keeper of secrets come, right? And that's something to think about. We haven't really produced another Muslim like Iqbal who has had this hawk's eye view of both traditions, right? Which is 1.6 billion Muslims, and not being able to produce one person like Iqbal is a fault of ours. But then he says, Sukhan. Can't read this 1930s Pakistani handwriting. Sukhan darisht magu dar tariq yari kush ke suhbat man o tu dar jahan khuda saz ast. That what is do not speak harshly. Try the way of yari kush. Try the way of speaking like a friend to me. Don't speak so harshly. Speak like the way of a friend, because you and I together are both the creation of God. And then he says, Kujast منزل این خاکدان تیز نهاد که هرچه هست چوره گراوان پرواز است. He says that what is the destination of this speck of dust, of this khakdan, of this lowly piece of dust, i.e. himself? که هرچه هست چوره گراوان, wherever there is shifting sand. Right, that image of moving and shifting sand in the desert, that's where you and I are sort of ending up. And then he says, Tanam galez khayaban jannat Kashmir dalam az haram Hijaz munavam ash-Shiraz. That my body is from the avenues of Kashmir, and my heart is from the Haram in the Kaaba, and my song is from Iran. So this is
all that.
Just bring all of that together. Yeah.
Okay, inshallah, I want to end on time. I know it's 7:30 was the time that you wanted to finish up.
Do you want to just do maybe one or two, or we can do the Sicily when he passes by Sicily?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. So Iqbal, when he was, he attended the Round Table Conference in London in 1931 or 1932, I believe, which was a conference between various Indian leaders about the independence of India. Was it going to be one country? Was it going to be two countries? Were Sikhs going to have a country? So invited various Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh politicians, and Iqbal was one of them. And on the way back, he stops in Spain, and he's the first Muslim to pray inside Masjid al-Qurtuba since the 14th century, which is sort of symbolic in a way. But also on the way, he passes by Sicily, which Muslims also ruled for 200 years. And he writes a poem, again, very curiously in Urdu and not in Farsi, which is, I think, a very interesting decision. But he starts off the line very beautifully. So it's called Jazira, Sicily, or Siqali. Siqali is the old names. So many Maliki fuqaha, Yunus al-Saqili, great Maliki faqih. He is from Sicily. So he starts off with the poem saying, so he's passing by on the boat past Sicily. Role Abdil khol kar ke dida khun babar wo nazar aata hai tahzeeb Hijaz ka mazar. Right, that weep to your heart's content, oh blood weeping eye. So this idea of always consuming blood coming out of the eye, right? Because that's seeing the world around. What's becoming apparent is the civilization of the Arabs, right? Like almost the lost totems, the mazar. So it's dead, right? It's the totem, it's the sort of grave, it's the tombstone of the lost Arab Islamic civilization. But at the end, and I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this, but he says, Rangi tasveer kohan mein bhar ke dikhla de mujhe. That paint this old picture of Islam once again, right? So this idea of why are Muslims stuck in the past? Why are they doing this? Why are they always talking about the past? But Iqbal is like, no, paint that picture again for me. That make me tremble with the stories of the old Muslims, right? And I want to hear a reflection from you. But then he ends the poem with, and then he addresses Sicily as a beloved, that मैं तेरा तोहफा सुए हिंदुस्तान ले जाऊंगा, खुद यहाँ रोता हूँ औरों को रुलाऊंगा. That, oh Sicily, I will take your gift to India, because Muslims do not really understand the history of Spain and Sicily because of the lack of communication. That he says, I will go inform Indian Muslims about your tragedy. I weep here, I will make others weep in India for you. So if you can sort of talk about nostalgia, why is Iqbal stuck in the past? He has that line of Kaun sunega Iqbal yo anjuman hi badal gayi hai. Nayi zamane mein आप हमको पुरानी बातें सुना रहे हैं, that, oh Iqbal, why do you tell us these old stories? The assembly has died. That in a new age you tell us, wait, nayi zamane mein, in this new age you tell us these old ancient stories.
No, I think, I mean, this you're talking about what we do as psychologists, right?
Yeah.
People come and talk to us, and we're not just saying, okay, let's just talk about today and tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
The idea is what led to where you are. And the only way you can overcome grief or the negative aspects of grief is by speaking about it. It's by owning it, right? Really, like, and processing it emotionally. Just the way he's saying, like, I'm crying here thinking about it, but I want people to cry, because that crying is an expression of the grief that they're feeling, and that actually is necessary. Yeah, you need to do that. Otherwise, I mean, if you've ever cried to something, right? After crying, you feel better. Right? You feel a little bit more calmer, and then you can work and do something. Like if you're struggling and suffering, and
if you haven't processed the grief,
yeah, then it's going to keep eating you up inside in a very harmful way. So this is like a tip I'm taking from Alama, as in like just kind of making sure that when we get a clients,
and also making sure others grieve with you.
Exactly. It's a group. It's like a support group that we're having.
Yeah,
right? Like sit and grieve and cry together.
Sicily, yeah. we should have that every week. We'll have a weep circle of various Muslim cities that were lost: Delhi, Sicily, Cordoba, Granada. Process it.
Yeah, not a bad idea. But as a psychologist, that's the thing that like I'm looking at, is that the idea of like when you sit and like let's say that if you had it's something difficult, right? Like
yeah,
it's difficult, and you feel like crying in that moment. Sometimes people can't do it, but the idea that you can't forget about something, so you have to go back to it. You have to readdress it. You have to kind of hash it out and then express yourself in whatever you were feeling at the time.
Yeah. On that note, do you feel like Muslims have processed the grief of like the past since Napoleon landed in Alexandria in 1788? Do you think we have, or we have a little bit more processing to do?
I feel like the issues that we see right now politically, and within like religion and philosophy of religion and all these issues and atheism, rising atheism, I feel like it's a result of that lack of processing. I think we don't want to talk about our past, and then we can't move to the future.
It's like the old Hyderabadi uncle, like who never received love from his parents, and then they they just keep it inside, and then they inflict that trauma on their kids.
Exactly.
We're doing that over and over again.
Are you Hyderabadi?
I am Hyderabadi.
Okay, you can make the joke.
I can make the joke. Yeah, I can make the joke.
I can make the...
But you know the stereotype though.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, it's intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is if we don't process the grief, we pass it on to our children in so many other ways.
Yeah, and I think this is important because it's not that our grandparents mistreated our parents out of some bay mahaba or unexcusably. It's that they have suffered for 4, 5, 6 generations. We have seen so much, and none of that has been processed. So it's not their fault. So people are like, oh, Muslims don't talk about mental health. Muslims don't know how to do this. We're so backward. We don't know how to process emotions. Well, it's like, do you know what we saw? Like I always tell the story of, Muslims ruled India for 800 years. And, the last Mughal king, 83 years old, his 2 sons outside of Nizamuddin in Delhi. And they were literally hiding in the tomb of Humayun, the Marcus of the Jamaat is right across the street. And 2 British generals take the last 2 crown princes. Imagine, Muslims have been ruling India for 800 years in Delhi, which was probably 10 times wealthier than Baghdad, Damascus, Istanbul, you name it. And they take the last 2 crown princes, 16, 18 years old, and from the entire Muslim population, and they strip them naked and shoot them dead. And, and that's something that I don't think Indian Muslims have really, or Pakistani Muslims have really grappled with, right? It's like because he represents a symbol, right? Or the fact that the last Ottoman Khalifa had to leave in the middle of the night, other Turkmen leave in the middle of the night, couldn't even say Khudafis to his own 600-year dynasty, and that's obviously that we still hold that memory forward. That's what we still always call that line of Bahadur Shah, right? And I think that this is an important step, and the fact that Iqbal's poetry was so maqbool, I mean, I think that there are probably perhaps 500 million Muslims who probably appreciate it in some sense between India, Pakistan, and the diaspora. And I don't know of any poet in the world who has a 500 million readership in history. I think maybe Shakespeare, but even then, people who are reading Shakespeare can quote even 2 lines of Shakespeare. I feel like there are at least 400 million people in the world who probably quote at least 1 or 2 lines of Iqbal. I don't think any poet in history has ever had that station. And Allah gave that to a Punjabi from Sialkot, and that's Allah gives to whomsoever He wills, and that's Yahdillahu li nurihi man yasha. And we ask that we carry that forward, which is really just poetry of grief. and hope to.
So tell you and this is the dua.
Yeah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا وسندنا ورسولنا وحبيبنا محمد. اللهم أنت السلام ومنك السلام وإليك يعود السلام. نسألك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. اللهم صل على جميع الملائكة والمرسلين فارحم عبادك المؤمنين من أهل السماوات والأرضين. اللهم أقسم لنا من خشيتك ما تحول به بيننا وبين معصيتك ومن طاعتك ما تبلغنا به جنتك ومن اليقين ما تهون به علينا مصائب الدنيا والآخرة ومتعنا الله بأسماعنا وأبصارنا بقوتنا يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من الهم والغم. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من الهم والغم. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من الهم والغم. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا وسندنا ورسولنا وحبيبنا ومحبوبنا وسندنا ونظمنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.
So inshallah we'll do more in the future on other topics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I just do topics on grief because I feel like we're not going to be able to build anything unless we process that grief.
That's true. Agree. We're in the right place.
Muslims, when the Mongolians sacked Baghdad, there's a very clear processing of grief. When Muslims lost Andalusia in North Africa and with the Ottomans, there's a very clear processing of grief. But I don't know if we've processed the grief from Napoleon Bonaparte and British in India, and obviously Palestine hurts us every day, right? So yeah. Inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Oh, go ahead.
Just a good question. Do you have any comments on why Iqbal received a lot of criticism on Asrar-e-Khudi? Just from the title itself, it seemed like, I remember, if I'm not mistaken, that he meant by Asrar-e-Khudi, Khudi as in self, but people at the time were thinking that the Khudi in Urdu and Persian means pride, and that received a lot of criticism just from the title. So, and it's something quite simple if you look at why would you have criticism of the title? So are scholars and people at times just looking for something to just kind of attack Iqbal?
No, yeah. So again, I would say that's a fiction. So if you read the introduction of Asrar-e-Khudi, the original print, he discusses that. So that would have been easy to explain. But he did receive a lot of flack for Asrar-e-Khudi for two major reasons. The first was the great Iranian poet Hafiz Shirazi. He critiqued him severely in the poem.
Yeah.
Hafiz Shirazi is before Iqbal, there was Hafiz in India. That was Iqbal sort of replaces Hafiz, which is kind of wild to think about. Like every Mughal king. Every Hindu sort of accountant will quote Hafiz Shirazi across 400 years in India. He was quoted on the streets of Hyderabad. We have thousands of his copies in the library of Hyderabad. Iqbal highly critiques Hafiz for being sort of taking Muslims from the real world, the real world to the fancies of imagination. And he was critiqued for 15 years. I was reading we have about 4,000 of his letters. I've been through about 1,200, trying to get to the end by the end of the year. And oh my God, he received so much flack for criticizing, so much so that in the next edition, in the 1913 edition, he removed the poetry. Yeah. And in fact, it was from one of his close friends who started Khaja Hasan Nizami, who was the Sajjad al-Nashin of Nizamuddin Awliya's tomb. Wow. They were close friends, and he was the one who was like, this is unacceptable, because Hafiz Shirazi was Hafiz. I mean, it's like today, imagine if I go up on the member and I'm like, Iqbal is hurting all of us. I would probably be hated. But that was the sort of audacity of Iqbal to do that, and he's in his right as a Persian poet. We should be able to critique people. There's no reason why we should not. And he was in his right as an accomplished Persian poet to do that. I think if an Urdu poet critiques Hafiz, it's weird. Or if an Arab poet critiques Iqbal, that's weird to me. But Iqbal as a Persian poet, I'd say Ali Raza, who was one of the greatest literary theorists of India and then Pakistan, said that we always talk about Iqbal as an Urdu poet, but Iqbal is actually a Farsi poet primarily.
He's got more poetry in Farsi.
He has more poetry, and just to call him just an Urdu poet is actually very disrespectful, because it's like calling Hafiz Shirazi, something, whatever XYZ. But yeah, that's
Good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, go ahead, Yasin.
So I think the imagery used for the ending of the Mughal dynasty was very moving.
Yeah.
And I think connecting that to the processing of grief in a larger community between other major cities, such as Cordoba, Granada, or Sicily, is also very moving for the Muslim community at large. And I think processing grief is one of the things we need to do.
Yeah.
Especially when reading history, which is sometimes very traumatic.
Yeah.
Even hundreds of years later, it is very traumatic to the community. But my question is, what lessons can we extrapolate from these events that have occurred across continents from Allah, perhaps, as a lesson for the community?
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Fahad, you want to take that?
You start. I mean, my mind goes more towards, I think, recognizing, like from the perspective of Alama Iqbal, right, which he goes into later, with the idea of khudi and like what is khudi and this the potential that Muslims have, right? So I think one lesson is that Muslims have the potential to be at to regain a status, right, and to be the Khalifa in this earth, and not to lose hope. And oftentimes people just look at like, well, Muslims are so far behind, they can't, but then when you bring out like facts like, oh well, Muslims are also developing vaccines and doing this and that, they kind of like selectively ignore that, right? So we have to recognize we do have the potential as individuals, but it requires a lot of work. Like character development is extremely important. Now I think in Muslim world there's this idea of revolutions. I disagree with that personally. Even in Pakistan, there's the idea of like revolution, right?
There's
Like,
inqilabs and
yeah, we need to like do that and change the system.
But inqilab is actually murdabad. It's murdabad,
But if you do change the system, people that character-wise, I think Muslims are suffering, right? Like if you go into the Muslim world now, like the way even keeping things clean, like it's a world of difference between a typical Muslim country versus a typical like Western country. So I think we have to kind of focus on those aspects of strengthening our khudi, and that in itself will take us. Like when he says khudi ko kar buland itna, right? Iske har takdeer se pehle khuda bande se khud puche batate jaza ke, that make your khudi to such an extent. Or in Asrar Khudi, he has that poem about 3 steps, and the last step is Niyabat Ilahi, right? So you go through Zabt al-Nafs, controlling yourself, and then you go through the second stage, which I'm forgetting. But after developing yourself, then you become the Naib of Allah. And when you're Naib of Allah, then the whole world is yours. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I would just add to that when Muslims were colonized, because it was such a devastating moment, because it was so unique, because even when the Mongolians sacked Baghdad and Isfahan and Samarkand and Bukhara, Muslims weren't really afraid of their intellectual sort of attack. Right? So it was like, okay, they're going to kill us, but we're not really worried about Mongolian, sort of religion of like replacing Islam. But like there was that deep fear, and that had never happened to Muslims before. Because after the Prophet ﷺ sort of presented Islam and the Quran to the world, at that point, Islam never really faced like a deep intellectual. Obviously like the Mu'tazila and the Greek stuff, but it was never like Ibn Sina and Farabi didn't reject Islam. They were still Muslim. They still saw the Prophet as the greatest human being on the face of the earth. So this was the first time that Muslims were ever intellectually really seriously challenged. And I think because of that, I feel like the lesson that I would learn, that let's say if Muslims recreate the Ottoman Empire and then face another decline, I would say that don't surrender so easily to the West wholesale, because when you read some of these sort of secular Indian Muslims, or even Ataturk's, when I read Ataturk's life, there's a great biography by this Princeton professor, and it's actually really sad, because I don't know if anybody knows, but he went to a Hifz madrasa, Ataturk. Imagine that, which is so crazy. He does. He calls him Ghazi, because in the beginning, because you have to remember, Ataturk knew Arabic. His Ottoman was phenomenal. His Ottoman is 90% Fusha, and he was also posted in Syria, so there's no. He could, he definitely memorized some. I think his father pulled him out, but he memorized some parts of it. So he starts off his life in the Hifz madrasa, right? Sort of the archetypal case of a traumatized Hifz student. We're still seeing it today. So don't traumatize the Hifz students too much. Or take out Islam from a country. But and his knowledge of Islam is deep. There is no doubt about that, right? But what you see is also that when the Ottomans start creating these military colleges, what they're doing is there's wholesale importing German materialist ideology. So Ataturk just becomes a victim of that, right? So there wasn't this sort of real reckoning with European knowledge. It was like, okay, we're just going to ignore it. We're going to ignore it. Okay, let's just adopt all of it. It was like, what is that? So I think that, because like even if you look at Ibn Sina and Farabi, whom people that I don't really respect, at least I'm going to respect Ghazali and Razi, because I feel like Ibn Sina and Farabi just did blind, and Ibn Rushd did blind taqlid of Aristotle, whereas Ghazali and Razi actually were like very critical of Aristotle and the Greeks. So that critical nature, I don't think we've really seen, right? Like who's like whenever Muslims go and study in the West, and they just go and they're like, well, Kant was right, and they just bring Kant and Hegel's ideas, even if they don't even know their figure. They just bring, and they're like, oh, we should do this. Thomas Paine was right. Thomas Jefferson was right. Alexander Hamilton was right. Wait, but like, why? Just because America has the highest GDP?
That's intellectual enslavement.
That's intellectual. I mean, the Mughals have had no empire in the world in the history of 5,000 years had a higher GDP than the Mughals. 25, 26%. Does that mean that I mean, I would believe that, but like, does that mean that mobile political theory is the best ever in the world, or we should actually evaluate and see why they achieved at such a high sort of GDP? You know, why did the British want to come to India before they wanted to go to any Arab
Right.
country? You know, so at least that's, I don't know if that's helpful.
And I think one cool thing about Iqbal is that he, I think they also call him a mujaddid, right?
Yeah,
That he didn't he used the traditional Islam but engaged with modernity. I think that's the other thing here too. I think from the religious circles, we also see the same kind of
Yep.
response where either you're too much into it and you lose track of your own grounding, or you don't want to even touch it. Like I don't want to talk about postmodernism. I don't want to talk about post enlightenment. So we need to use, like the Quran uses the Christians at the time and Jews at the time, their arguments to even get support for the Quran.
yeah.
Right. So like Iqbal did the same thing where he would use the reality of their time and to support his argument. And I think we kind of should be doing the same thing right
And
now.
I think what's so, and I think we should probably another. I think what's so fascinating is that Iqbal did this 120 years ago when there was no predecessor. He was alone in England when there were, I think, like 45 Muslims total in London, right? And he goes there, and he's not an alim, but he's very well studied, and he doesn't buy it. He doesn't buy modernity, which is so wild. And there are Muslims today, despite so much scholarship and so much engagement with the West, they're still going to universities and they're surrendering to modernity. They're surrendering to Western modernity. So I think the question we have to ask is, why is Iqbal able to go? By the way, he's the first Muslim, I'm saying, from the Arab world, from the Turkish world, the first one to get a PhD in the West. He's also, from my understanding, the first Muslim to get a degree from Oxford, i.e. Oxford or Cambridge. I don't know of any Muslim before him, definitely Muslims after him. And yet he doesn't surrender, which is so wild to think about, because it's like, I believe that if I were in that position, when your country is literally colonized by them, when your country is broke, and you're like, Muslims have not presented an alternate model. You just have these old Mughal intellectual philosophical books on wujud and stuff, and you're still like, no, I'm not going to buy it, and we have something superior. That's, I think, the most beautiful act of Iqbal. He says, "Ye fezani nazar tha ya maktab ki karamat thi." He says that my life, was it because some friend of Allah looked at me, or was it the miracle of the small little madrasa? Because obviously his father ensured that he got a very strong Arabic and Persian education at a young age, when language is important. Then he says, "Kisne sikhai Ismail ko adab farzandi." Who taught Ismail alayhi salam how to be a son? Right? That when he tells his father that, U'mur, that command me, I will obey your commands. So who taught Ismail salam how to be a son? Was it the miracle of the small little madrasa, or was it the glance of the wali? Iqbal doesn't answer the question, but he sort of leaves it open-ended. But I think truly both are with Iqbal. The miracle of the madrasas, those small little maktabs, the Mughal little maktab madrasa. By the age of 12, you can read Arabic fluently, not just without meaning, with meaning. So I think that miracle of Islamic primary school education is, Iqbal is, I think, the last probably product of that. Yeah, subhanAllah. But thank you. Sorry, Abdullah.
Hopefully, last question. I would say you mentioned how for previous civilizations, we Muslims processed the trauma and recovered from it to a degree, because Muslim civilizations went through trauma, and you said they processed it, whereas in the case of, for example, the Mughals coming into the current Indo-Pak population, we did not have. Can you explain how you think they processed that, and what marks that recovery process for them that we're struggling to accomplish today?
I don't know if they processed. I don't think there was such a big trauma as the one that happened after. Like post-colonial trauma is probably the most significant.
Yeah, it's most significant
trauma that that Muslims had to go through, because I think in the past there were wars, but like processing that was a little bit different than here, where you went from like ruling the world to like not having any control.
Yeah.
That's what I think. I don't know if this is.
Yeah, I would say, like, so when I said processing, I guess I meant that in a, I mean, so like I guess I'm talking about like qasaid of like Spanish Arab poets when they lose like Granada and Spain, Rawandi, and so forth.
Yeah.
And then also sort of this, I mean, the Ottoman, which is wild, because as Muslims are losing Spain, I mean, the Ottoman, Bayezid Yildirim is literally, I mean, Muslims are kicked out of Spain in 1492. But obviously, like, they're losing battles in the 1450s. At the same time, Muslims conquered Constantinople. So, in many ways, I don't know if the Muslim world actually felt Spain as like a huge loss, because it was like Constantinople was like the second Rome. So 1453, I think Muslim conquered Constantinople. So I feel like, but I think that even just the fact of like just that poetry, and from what I've seen, only Iqbal has really wrote on this sort of condition. I mean, everyone sort of just took the free verse, her eyelashes are torturing me kind of poetry vibe for the past 100 years. But yeah, thank you guys so much. Inshallah, we'll end there. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you.